You're listening to Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, a podcast offered in partnership with Missio Alliance. Each episode, we discuss internal and relational pressures, how they block effective leadership, and how we can move through them to a greater health. And now your host, Steve Cuss.
Well, friends, let's get right to our guest. I am really excited today to be hosting Jeff Goins. Jeff, probably didn't know this, but he's been a huge benefit to me as I've put this podcast out and as I wrote my book. Not only is he himself a creative, he's an artist, but he also helps people who are trying to do creative work figure out how to do it in the public space. He's written books about it. His book, The Art of Work, and also I love his book, Real Artists Don't Starve. Both these books are evidence of Jeff's actual creative gift himself, but also really practical. I've got links in the show notes. But also Jeff offers a number of tools on his website, goinswriter.com, also linked in the show notes. A number of tools to help anybody who is doing their work in the public sphere. And I know as a pastor, and I know a lot of our listeners are faith leaders, it's pretty awkward to figure out how to put yourself out there without showboating or without drawing unnecessary attention to yourself, and particularly in a market where so many people are doing it. Jeff, to me, is really one of the leading voices on this, not just because of his experience and expertise, but I think as you'll pick up in this interview, because of his posture, because of his thoughtfulness. Jeff is wise. He's just gone through this. He has a real humility about him that I think is going to be evident in this podcast. I really enjoyed this interview. So I began by asking Jeff just what it was like in the early days when he first started putting himself out there and what it was like to face his vulnerability. And that's where we got going, and you can listen in. So Jeff, you've been at this, the professional writing for, by my count, almost a decade. I think it was 2011 when you really started hitting this professionally. I'd be interested in hearing from you in those early days what it was like to deal with vulnerability, because obviously you're an artist and your craft is public, and so you're definitely putting yourself out there. Could you just tell us a bit about the early days of first putting yourself out there and what was going on in your head?
Sure. So about a year ago, I was having breakfast with Stephen Pressfield, the author of The War of Art. In another life, he was a screenwriter, best-selling novelist, wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, Gates of Fire. And he said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "Writing?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I since the end of 2010. And he goes, "Oh, so not long then." And I said, "Well, I guess not."
Now that you mentioned it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here's somebody who struggled with calling himself a writer and answering the calling of writer for decades, for years, most of his 20s, 30s, and even early 40s were kind of him figuring out what his path in life was going to look like. And The Legend of Bagger Vance didn't come out until Steve was nearly 50, I believe. And now he's in his 70s. So I loved that perspective because I can look at this and go, "Hey, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know a thing or two." And, those are the early days back in 2010, 2011, 2012. And according to Steve, I am still in those early days. And I gladly accept that way of thinking about it, because I think it's helpful. Back in the Renaissance, an apprenticeship would take about 10 years, 7 years of working in the shop with the master, 2 to 3 years of being a journeyman, and then you would submit your work to the guild, and they would tell you if it qualified or not as a masterpiece, and then you'd be accepted in the guild and become a master, and you could take on apprentices. So I am just now, if we're following that system, getting to the point where I can actually practice this vocation as a legitimate profession. Anyway, I love that story because I like the idea that I'm just getting started. And I hope that's true. Not that old yet. I'm 36, and I hope I have many decades of work to come. But in those early days, especially 2011 was a big year for me where I just decided to start writing every day, no matter what. I had tried to launch previous blogs in the past and they had all failed. And the thing that they all had in common was that I had quit them. And so I started this experiment with myself, which was, what happens if I don't quit this time, right? What if I just keep going? There wasn't a blog or writing project that I hadn't quit after 6 months. And so what if I just kept going at that 6-month hump? And so I started my latest blog that I have today with that intention, that I will just write every day for 2 years without fail and then see what happens. And there was something fun about that shift in focus away from writing and seeing what would happen to like just writing a bunch of stuff. And the metric for success became showing up instead of just doing something in hope, hoping that 1 million people read it or whatever. And I thought of it as practicing in public. I had read a blog post by Seth Godin once where he says, nobody gets talker's block. They get writer's block, but they don't get talker's block. And he said, you should write like you talk, which is to say, do it often and in public. So I thought, practice in public. I like that. And so writing as a means of practicing in public, putting my work out there in front of other people, but really just doing it for me. But putting myself out there in a way that if somebody wanted to notice this, they could. It was the perfect blend of me showing up, not being able to hide, because if you're doing it in public, you can't hide. And then doing it without expectation of any results, trusting that whatever happened would happen. And it was a very freeing place to be. In some ways, I miss that time because I could do anything, and this could be
right
anything. And there was something very pure about just doing it to see if I could do it, if I had what it took.
I know in my own life when I've been in vocational ministry for like 25 years, but I've been a lead pastor for 14, and the first 2 or 3, even though I had preached before, I'd never preached every week. I'd never had to get up week after week.
Right.
And I really appreciate what you're saying about putting yourself out there and not being able to hide. How long did it take you to get used to feeling that exposed where you're okay with it?
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever been completely okay with it. It's funny. I think in terms of public facing vocations, like a communication based job, it seems to me that the hardest jobs would be professional comedy, just because it's you live or die by the moment.
Yeah,
and probably preaching, because it's, I do public speaking quite a bit, but I have like 3 speeches that I do over and over and over again. And I don't do them every week. If I'm lucky, I do them twice a month, but every week, theoretically, you've got to have a new sermon, new stories, new illustrations, some new passage of the Bible, maybe. So I do think that requires a great deal of courage and a willingness to not hide pieces of yourself because it's so exposing. But I interviewed way back when I was just getting started as a writer. I was writing for magazines. I interviewed a Reformed minister by the name of R.C. Sproul. And I asked him how he preached, and he does all of his, he's passed away now, but he had done all of his preaching extemporaneously. And I asked him, I said, or do you ever get nervous? Because he'd been doing it since his 20s. He'd been doing it for 40 years at this point. And he said, I cannot remember a time when I was not nervous. And I thought, well, I can think of a way where you could make those nerves go away. Maybe write out the speech ahead of time. But because he did it all extemporaneously.
Yeah, that's just I had no idea he preached that way. That's a mind blowing.
Yeah. But I cannot remember a time where I wasn't nervous. I love the honesty of that. No, I'm more nervous today than I was before. I think greater stakes. If I send the wrong email to hundreds of thousands of people, that's a bad thing. There's a much greater consequence for failure now. I do think there was a conditioning, perhaps like an athlete, you realize that pain is not necessarily an enemy, right? To the writer, fear is not necessarily an enemy. It's just part of the job. Elizabeth Gilbert describes fear as like the passenger that will accompany you in every single road trip on every creative venture you take. Fear is somebody sitting in the passenger seat. And the best thing that you can do is acknowledge fear and go, hey, I see you there. I remember you. The fact that you're here tells me we're going someplace special. So you're welcome to stay, but you don't get to steer and you don't get to pick the music. And I think that over time, I got used to the fact that every time I sit down to write something, create something, it was going to be a scary endeavor. And that fear started to comfort me because it was familiar. So I never got over it. I just got used to it.
Yeah. As I was hearing you talk as well, I really love the way you framed your intentional posture as a rookie or as an apprentice. You mentioned the guilds and it triggered so many things for me. I have a mild obsession with acoustic guitars, and I've got a couple of guitars. My favorite one, handcrafted by one man and his son from Northern Ireland, named Dermot McElroy. And he, exactly as you mentioned, he apprenticed for 10 years with a more famous luthier before he began his own field. What it made me think of too, though, Jeff, was Ira Glass, the host of This American Life. He talks about how we all get into our creative field because of our taste, but when we start producing creativity, our product does not match our taste. There's a big gap between our taste and our product. Could you tell us a bit about that? What's that been like for you?
Yeah. I love that story of the luthier. I think that we live in an age where everybody wants to be a master, but few people are willing to be apprentices first. And it's powerful when you are forced into some sort of vocation that requires that. It teaches you something about life that our culture in Western society doesn't necessarily reinforce too much these days, which is that life is hard and good things take time. That's just not a lesson that you have to learn immediately. I think life eventually wins out and teaches you that, but there's so many quote unquote quick fixes and shortcuts that alleviate the anxiety of that reality, which is that things are hard and things take time. And if you want to be really, really great at something, be patient. But yeah, I love that video series that Ira Glass did. It's actually, people don't realize that's a very old series on YouTube. I used to use it when I was training missionaries on how to tell their stories. It's a storytelling series, and it got turned into some cool video that somebody created with him narrating that particular part where he talks about what's been called the taste talent gap. But the whole series is like 5-part, 6-part series in storytelling, and he's just talking about how he got started as in broadcast journalism at NPR. I find that really comforting that early on your taste will exceed your talent, and that's a good thing. It means you have good taste, and if you find yourself doing work that you're not particularly proud of, be encouraged. If you're the best writer that that's not very inspiring. Right. I jokingly told a friend recently, I said, your problem is you're the most interesting person and she was like, that's true, I am.
Good.
And
that's amazing.
And it was like a sad revelation. Like, I need to Like if I am the one who inspires myself the most, I need greater inspirations, right?
Well, that makes me want to ask you then, Jeff, because you are your reputation is as a first class writer, and it's not surprising the amount of sweat you've put in on a daily basis for years, right? Like you coach people on the habit. I would love to hear then, what are you working on right now to improve your craft?
That's a good question. I'm in this funny season, I think, where I'm really trying to trust myself more. I'm trying to trust the work that I've done. I'm also trying to trust my intuition. And so that means, and I hesitate to say these things because I don't want somebody to go like turn them into, gospel truth for themselves. But this is working quite well for me. First of all, I got into this kind of game just writing every single day, writing 500 words a day for years and years and years and years. And after a year of doing that, I got much better than I had ever been. And my friend Michael Hyatt said to me, he goes, "You're finding your voice."
Yeah.
And I was like, I am? Wow, that feels really good. I'm really excited. So, showing up, doing the work is a part of the creative process. And early on, I did struggle with feeling like what I wanted to do and what I was capable of doing were so far apart. I still feel that way. I'm still chasing horizon. The poet David White says in one of his poems, that life is essentially about chasing a horizon, even if you never reach it. That there's something powerful and spiritual about the process of creating anything where you are making something that you will never fully actualize in this life, perhaps. And that's the point of art. The point of art is to actually point to something beyond itself, which is why somebody can look at a Van Gogh painting and get multiple, different people can get different sort of perspectives and impressions of the work. For me, today, the best thing that I can do for my writing is to go for a walk, is to actually step away from the computer and get inspired. Anne Lamott says there's a difference between being blocked and feeling empty. And I have the capacity to sit down and write anything at any time. That's not a difficulty for me. I always have something to say. I'm a big talker. So I can sit down, open up a Word document and start writing. But there are these moments, these flashes of genius and insight. And when they come, I try to trust them. And for a long time, I didn't, because that's not a very reliable work schedule as a writer to go. I write when I feel inspired. I think it's a Jack London quote. I only write when I feel inspired. And I happen to feel inspired. Maybe I think it's Ray Bradbury, actually. Jack London says, inspiration, you got to go knock it over the head and drag it home. Ray Bradbury says, I believe in inspiration, and I only write when I'm inspired, and I happen to be inspired every single morning at 9 a.m.
Right.
So there's something to that, and I have a set writing time every single morning. But the best thing that I do for my work these days is get out into nature. I've been reading a lot of Emerson and Thoreau lately, and these men and women, the transcendentalists, that was really a rebirth of an ancient way of thinking and writing, philosophy, art, literature, that was about, the artist's connection with nature, well, women as well. And I'm finding a lot of inspiration in solitude in nature. And I would argue that in nature, I am far from alone.
Good, yeah.
So there's something about it. There's something about me getting out of the office, going for a walk, getting out into the world. I'll walk for an hour or two almost every morning on days when it's warm. These days, I'm in Nashville and it's a little bit cold outside, and so I go maybe tomorrow. But there is something incredibly invigorating about that practice. And I felt guilty about it for a while, because like, well, I should just be in my chambers writing. And then I read this essay by Thoreau called Walking, where he basically says he walked 4 to 6 hours a day. And he said, if you're not walking, you're not really living. He says, I can't imagine what it's like to be, part of the dying populace that's stuck inside all day, just sitting down, hunched over their work. And so it took me a long time to realize, as an editor once told me, my friend Joel Miller, that sometimes not writing is writing. And I again shudder to share this advice because somebody could misapply it. I think it's good to have discipline. I don't always get inspired, but when inspiration does strike me, I don't deny it, and I don't hide from it. I chase it down because it's rare and beautiful, and good stuff comes from it. And those moments happen more often when I get away from my work and I go for a walk.
Yeah, I was watching, I think it was either an interview with you or I was watching a keynote you gave, and you quoted Derek Sievers. You just said, what's obvious to you is amazing to someone else.
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting both for our listeners to try to figure out what's obvious to them, but I think what would be helpful is to hear from you. What's just one thing that you think is obvious that you have been surprised it amazes other people when you share it?
Yeah, well, I think the hardest part of answering this question is you don't know. It's like you don't know what's obvious to you, which is ironic because it's obvious, but it's so obvious that you can't see it as something separate from your identity.
Or is that because you assume that it's obvious to everyone?
Kind of, but it's like, what am I good at? I don't know. And then people say you're good at this, and it's like, well, nah, not really. And they're like, no, that's so easy to you, and that's so difficult to me. Really? Oh, okay. I think that solving problems is pretty easy to me. Certain kinds of problems, I suppose, but I actually really thrive on emergencies. It's where I do my best work, and I have a bit of childhood trauma in my past. I hesitate to use that word because it means so many different things to different people. But there's stuff, down in that cellar. And, I think what that taught me to do, conditioned me rather, was, stay in this state of low grade anxiety where anything can happen. And so you've got to be ready for anything, which I imagine you understand.
Yeah.
And, what I have done consciously more recently is use that to my advantage in a way where I'm not in that low grade state of anxiety, but where I can kind of push a button and go, oh, we've got 30 days to write a book. Let's go. Right. Let's turn on the hyper focus and let's get rolling. And the shadow side of that for me is, I can procrastinate. I mean, I do procrastinate, but I can wait until the last minute where it's emergency mode. And now I have all this energy.
Yeah.
Instead of, taking the appropriate time to do the work. And so I've got to balance that. And I don't know that I've perfected that, but I'm at least aware of the fact that I do that. I feel all the things that a person would feel, I think, when a deadline is approaching, when there's some big impossible project. But I don't shut down. I get really excited. And so impossible things feel very exciting to me. And I'm often surprised by how discouraged people are by challenges. I remember an interview with Jim Henson where somebody said, did you ever imagine that you would have been this successful? And he said, of course I did. How else would I have done it? And he says, I know that I'm supposed to say no and pretend to be humble and like this was all a surprise. But the truth is I saw all of this very clearly, and I accomplished it because I saw it and because I was focused on it. And I don't want to say that success is easy, but I am often surprised by how daunted people feel about big goals, when I have always felt very excited about them. And there's a part of me that knew I was going to do all of this from the very beginning. And I, of course, doubted it and questioned it and was fearful of it. But there's been very few things that have truly surprised me. Now, in the moment, I would have said, oh, gosh, look at this. Gee willikers, you know? And it's great. And I'm incredibly grateful for it. I don't mean to sound arrogant or anything, but I believe that there is a certain piece of the puzzle, the formula of success that requires intention, requires you to know what you're doing and how it's all going to work and all of that. And so the things that seem obvious to me are, you've got 12 seconds to do this. All right, great. Let's go. I thrive in a state of emergency. The easiest time to do the work is at the last possible moment. I get most excited about and get most energy from that. And then secondly, it seems obvious to me that if you're in a state of struggle, like you should know what you need to do to get out of that struggle. And I come from, pretty lower middle class family, didn't have much growing up. I paid for college with scholarships and financial aid, worked in the summers to buy my books. My parents helped a little bit as they could, but they couldn't afford to send us kids to college. And I never would have said we were poor. That's a subjective thing. We got a new outfit for school every year, and that was our new clothes, and it was fine. But looking back, I realized, oh, wow. I took my son recently to the house I grew up in, which is like maybe 1,000 square feet. He was like, that's it. I was like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And there's something about growing up of little means that in the back of my mind at a very early age, and I don't think this was a healthy thought, and I've become aware of it and kind of worked through some of it, but there was a voice that said, I am never going back to that. And so I don't understand when people settle for failure, because for me, it's a dare. I have failed. I have fallen flat on my face. I'm not saying everything I touch turns to gold. Definitely not. But when I fail, I get angry. When I get angry, I get motivated to do something. And sometimes, it's a challenge. I can lack empathy for a person who is so discouraged and defeated that they just want to give up, because that's not on my radar. It's not something that I can relate to.
What I hear you saying is with the Jim Henson example and your own life story, it's not arrogant. You're just clear on your vision and you go after it. But the second thing I heard you say, Jeff, is you don't get stuck. You don't stay stuck. Like, you put yourself out there and there's failure and unexpected issues and obstacles, but you're energized by plowing through them. Yeah,
I am. I like figuring things out. I like solving other people's problems. And in my 20s, I basically thought all of my friends had given me an open invitation to give them advice. Hey, I know what to do.
Yeah, great.
Nobody had ever at any point explicitly or implicitly given any kind of invitation whatsoever to that.
Yeah.
And I lost a few friends over that. Here's what you should do, blah, 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 blah. And I think maybe that comes from being an older brother. I was the oldest of 4 kids. I am 7, 10, and 19 years older, respectively, than my 3 siblings. But I was the one who went out and did things. I was the first one to college. I had to succeed. I had to kind of go beyond what my parents had done. I mean, these are all internal things. This is, sometimes I think people go, well, the parents must have pressured them. For a firstborn child, often it's all internally motivated, right? Like, I'm going to go do this. I've got to prove something. And I was clear on what I wanted to do. And there was a very unhealthy version of this that I struggled with for many years, where I was doing it to prove something to someone, and it wasn't working, right? I talked to my dad, and he seemed proud of me, but I was like, I still feel anxious. What's going on? And I realized that I was chasing after the wind, and I had to get a bigger vision for what I wanted to accomplish that went beyond I'm trying to prove something to someone.
The final question I want to ask, which I think is right in your area of expertise, is you're one of our go-tos on how to establish a platform and how to get your ideas out in the market of ideas. And I'm going to have a link in the show notes to your website, because you've got all kinds of tools to help us with that. What I'm interested in, Jeff, is as somebody who first started doing that last year, my work with chronic anxiety and systems theory, I've been teaching locally for 8 or 9 years. I've been living with it for 23 years. Wow. But I finally put my little leaf in the stream of publishing and the podcast and just public life just over a year ago. My book came out 6 months ago, and then the podcast came out just over a year ago. It's a very long-winded question. But what has surprised me as a novice and a rookie is it feels like the market of ideas, the level of saturation is significantly higher than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. And the acceleration of saturation is also increasing.
Right.
What's your take on that?
I recently rewatched Midnight in Paris, which I love that movie. And if you've not seen it, the basic plot, it's a Woody Allen film. The basic plot is this writer is in Paris, and one night he's hanging out outside at midnight, and this carriage comes by and picks him up and takes him back into the 20s in Paris, where he meets Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, Pablo Picasso, and so on. And he's like, this is the golden age. This, like, if I could live at any time in history, I would live in 20s I would live in the 20s in Paris in the rain. And then when he's in the 20s, he falls in love with this French woman, and they're hanging out one night at midnight in the 20s in Paris, and the carriage comes and picks them up and takes them back to the late 1800s, the Belle Epoque. And she says, this is the golden age. This is where you've got all the impressionists and post-impressionists, Toulouse-Lautrec, and all these people hanging out, talking about arts and Gauguin and all these people. And it's this idea that there was a golden era. It's a fallacy, right? There's this idea that there was a golden era that was better then than it is now. And human beings love this idea, right? Make America great again is that idea. And it's not true, right? And but when did an idea have to be true for us to want to believe it?
For sure, yeah.
So I think you could very easily, you do see this often with writers. You see them complaining about things that they've always complained about, right? Which is that the market is now saturated and yada, yada, yada. Is it more saturated than it was then? Sure, I guess. It's just, it just is what it is. And I believe that this goes back to the thing that I take for granted. Like, I like problems. I believe that every problem creates an opportunity. And is it true that it was easier to succeed then than it is to succeed now? Sure, fine. But when I started blogging in 2010, 2011, I felt like I was super late to the game, right? So when people tell me, well, you got started early, I go, no.
Yeah, it's good.
My friend Darren Rouse, who started ProBlogger in 2005, he got started early. When I talked to him, he goes, no. when so-and-so got onto, LiveJournal back in the late 90s, they, and so it's like there's always an earlier time, a better time to get started. Now, that doesn't mean that things aren't changing. Things are certainly changing in the publishing industry. Things are certainly changing online. There are hundreds of millions of blogs instead of, millions of them, just a decade before. So things are changing. And when things change, I ask two questions. What has always been true, right? What are the principles, not the strategy? So most of what I do, which is very different, and often I felt insecure about this, and now I'm realizing it wasn't a bad idea. Most of what I do when I teach about platform is I teach principles, not strategies. A principle is almost always true. A strategy changes often, right? And a tool changes even more often. So for example, email marketing is a strategy. It's a tool that can and will change, right? It's still an effective marketing strategy, but it's a tool. And 25 years from now, we may be using some other technology to replace email. We probably will be. But the principle is permission, which is you need permission to communicate with an audience, to share your ideas with them. So I ask, what are the principles? What's always been true that will probably continue to be true? When I wrote a book called Real Artists Don't Starve, I had these 12 different rules, basically going from Michelangelo all the way through the present. These are the things that creative professionals have done for the past 500 years that still work today. There were principles. They weren't like get an email list, right? That's an application of the principle. So I think you've always got to figure out the principle, right? The other question is, what does this make possible, right? So if blogging is done and dying and whatever, what does this make possible, right? And what it makes possible is maybe podcasting or, for example, Napster, right? So the music industry faced this. So people don't need to buy CDs anymore because, or MP3s, because of streaming and because they can download this stuff for free. So what does it make possible? Well, it makes possible for us to push people, because people are more aware of our music because they're getting it for free. So we can push people to live shows. And, the industry, the concert industry is booming. It's never been better because of that. And so every death creates an opportunity for a new birth, for a resurrection, if you will. And you just have to be looking for that. You have to be adaptable, I think. If you're trying to get back to the good old days, good luck with that, Grandpa. That's just not how life works. That's not how the world works. Everything is always changing, and you need to adapt. I like what Jeff Bezos said about Amazon. He said, "We're stubborn on vision, but flexible on details." I think of my creative career as that. I have a vision of wanting to be a writer and share my ideas with the world. How that works out and the details of things, I don't really care. I can do that with a blog, with a book, with a speech, with a podcast. I like all of those modalities and mediums. And I play with all of them, and I'm looking for opportunities to see what emerges. And really all I'm trying to do is keep dancing, keep doing my dance, keep doing my thing, and not have to go get a real job.
Very good. Well, Jeff, if you're ready, let's move into our gauntlet of anxiety questions.
Bring on the gauntlet. Bring on the anxiety.
Hey, let's do it. Let's make you anxious to wrap up the episode.
I was hoping.
Yeah. So a couple of things. Anxiety is a broad topic, and the nature of these questions is focused on chronic anxiety. Okay. PTSD or generalized anxiety disorder, those are out of my realm. Chronic anxiety is, I think, what most artists face, most leaders face. It's simply what you believe you need to be okay that you don't really need. So, for example, I've heard you say, I think it was in an interview, that you have a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, or you overcommit yourself and then you have to scramble. Yeah, and that may not be a current challenge of yours, but that would be the evidence of anxiety. People misunderstand and think anxiety is worry and fear, but it's actually everything that we think and do to try to get something that we think we need that we don't really need. So with that really long-winded intro, are you able to name something that you believe you need that you don't actually need to be okay?
I think that I need to be busy. So I will make a list of, I literally did this, it's not an exaggeration. I made a list of 15 things to do the other day. And then as I'm making the list, I thought, well, what about this? And what about this? It'd be nice to do that. And what about this? And I ended up with a list of like 27 things. And by the end of the day, I'd gotten 11 things done. And I felt a little bit disappointed. And there is this nervous energy that I feel when I'm writing out the list. I'm excited to do all these things. And yet I know that I'm not going to accomplish all of them. But I feel like I've got to stay busy, that I can't just sit still. Now through the practice of meditation, going for walks, I've calmed down quite a bit. I can be still, but there's still just kind of like my default is do something, and it could be anything. If I'm at home with the family, and there's dishes in the sink, instead of sitting down with my kids while they eat dinner, I'll be tempted to want to go wash the dishes or pick up or just like do things. I remember one time talking with my wife, and we were talking, she goes, "You're not listening to me." I said, "What are you talking about?" And I was like listening to her, but I was so nervous. I didn't realize this, wasn't conscious of this, but I felt a little bit of anxiety as I became more aware of it. And I had to do something with that energy because we were talking about something serious. I can't remember what. And so I was cleaning the kitchen while she was talking to me, wiping something down, putting something away. I'm listening. But it was like, I've got to do something. I've got to do something with this energy. And so activity for me has been a means of dealing with the anxiety. And the really scary part is I've been really successful with that, right? Because I've always felt a little bit of anxiety. I'll do lots of things. And if I do lots of things, some of them will work.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and you actually mentioned something that leads to the next question is I believe the best way to begin understanding chronic anxiety is to notice where it shows up physiologically. And the options are a spinning mind, a racing heart, or a tightening gut.
Yeah.
Would you be able to name where anxiety begins for you?
Yes, all those things sound true to me.
Yeah.
I do feel like, in addition to that, I struggle to nap because when I lie down, I'm thinking about a bunch of things and I can't stop thinking, but I go so hard during the day that when I put my head on my pillow at night, I'm out, which is kind of interesting. So I can't rest during the day, but at the end of the day, I'm just out. I don't know. I don't know if it's anxiety, stress. I suppose that's related. But I feel it in my shoulders. I'll be walking through the day and I'll be sort of have clenched shoulders and I'll become aware of it. And I'll go, why don't I just let go of that? Oh, I can just let go of that.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, or I'll hunched over a little bit. I'll kind of straighten my back and I'll go, what is that about? I have a friend who does body work and he says that means that you don't feel supported and blah, 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 blah. All this woo-woo stuff that I think is true, but struggle to believe applies to me. And
yeah, that's right.
But yeah, I'll feel that. I'll go, oh, or I think the most notable way is breathing, shallow breath. And I'll just stop and I'll take a deep breath and I'll go, oh, I haven't done that for like a day,
Good. One of the gifts of this science called family systems theory is that it actually gives you tools to notice generational traits that either you are holding or that have a hold on you. I call it family propaganda. It's things that might be true, but you think they must be true all the time.
Yeah. Wow.
And so oftentimes you can go back through your family tree and you can start to notice generational traits through your family, and they can be positive or negative. Would you be willing to name a family trait that's either helpful for you or a threat to your well-being?
This could be physical.
It's
mental.
typically a belief. Like,
Belief.
I'll give you an example from my life. I did a genogram, which is a family tree that is connected with emotional relationships.
Yeah.
And it was the first time in my life that I realized that cusses, that's my last name, cusses actually don't always know the answer. And for generations in my family, we are very certain about ourselves. And it's part of our charm, but it's also, as you might imagine, extremely obnoxious to people. But it wasn't until I did a genogram, I was 24 as a chaplain when I did mine, that I even understood that that wasn't just a given. And so I was in the grip of that belief and had to repent of it, I guess. And then for me, the positive threat is we have some incredible resilience that has served me well, that's been passed down generation to generation.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to do that. I'm not quite sure, but I'll take a guess. An early belief that I had that I think extends definitely to my father, my mother, my grandparents is, and I remember picking it up very clearly at about age 6. And the phrase was, "There will never be enough."
There you go.
And I remember picking that up when I was 6. My parents had just gotten in a fight or something. And whenever my mom and dad would get in a fight, my mom would often take me somewhere and buy me something. And she took me to McDonald's and she said, "What do you want for lunch?" And I said, "We can't afford it." And I remember her being super surprised by it, and since then I have always kind of thought there'll never be enough. So you've got to protect what you have and strive for more. And my dad, has always been a dreamer, always had, some new thing. My parents always talked about moving here, going there, or doing that. And often wouldn't do those things. I mean, I watched my dad at 48 years old, move his family from Northern Illinois to Northern Alabama, chase a dream, start a restaurant. I mean, I saw him do it. It was really inspiring. And then his father, moved his family across the country for a job. And so I think the positive part of that is I come from a long lineage of dreamers, it seems.
Yeah, that's right.
And the negative is obviously there'll never be enough. So you could live in this constant state of ingratitude and anxiety and fear of losing what you have.
Oh, it's great, Jeff. Like, I'm very aware with the Gauntlet that it's pretty difficult for a guest to be introduced to a concept and then immediately asked to share about it.
Yeah.
You nailed it. That's exactly an example. That's cool. Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another thing Family Systems offers us is it teaches us how to pay attention to anxiety spreading in a group. And the theory is that it's always contagious.
Yeah, and interesting.
Yeah, oftentimes the most anxious person in the room has the most power.
Wow.
Have you ever seen that, or does that bring a story to mind that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've seen it many times. I think I see it with our kids. When I'm feeling nervous, and not even realizing it, but I'm just kind of hyped up. I'll come home and I'll bring that energy home, and the kids will start acting up, and I'll realize that they're sort of mirroring my behavior. They're not listening or messing around at the dinner table or whatever. And it actually reminds me of this thing that I'm learning about our dog, which is, he becomes very aggressive around other dogs when he's on a leash. When he's not on a leash, he's very nice. When he's on a leash, he becomes very aggressive. Well, I've noticed that part of that is because when we walk towards another dog, I immediately stiffen the leash.
Yeah, good.
And so what I've been experimenting with is actually loosening the leash, even walking over to the dog, letting him, sniff the dog's behind or whatever. And sometimes just like, come on, let's go, not even being a big deal. I'll sort of like tug it and then I'll let it loose. I'll tug it and then I'll let it loose. Like, all right, let's go. But I'm not like constant tension. So it's not stressing him out, and that's working really well. And I was like, man, it was a metaphor. How many situations in my life am I showing up tense, and it's creating tension around everybody else? And I certainly see it with the kids.
You are a gifted problem solver. There's a very technical term in systems theory called second order change. And it's the ability to notice a pattern that's recurring and predictable, like you and your dog and your leash. And then the second step is to notice how you are complicit in the problem. And then that's how you break the pattern. You just laid that out beautifully for us. Man, Anyway, for a rookie, you're like got a systems perspective that's pretty cool.
Oh, I love it. Thanks.
All right. Last question.
Okay.
I think anxiety is most powerfully displaced by laughter, and I think more profoundly by unconditional love. So when in your life do you feel most fully loved?
So I can think of a specific time. There was a moment. I mean, lots of moments, of course. Maybe not, of course. But I've had lots of moments like that. But when I think of that term, there's a time that I think of, and it was I was in college and I was dating this girl that was much older than me, and I had a week off from work and I wanted to go see my girlfriend, this girl that I was dating. And I asked my parents. She was much older. Her parents were out of town for the week. She wanted me to come stay at her house. And my parents were like, I'm not sure about this. I was always, a good kid. They didn't like the idea that I would be staying with this woman alone by myself. It was just not something that I would have done. And I got really mad. And I think I even cried, very petulant. And I was like, you won't let me do anything. And I was asking to borrow their vehicle. I didn't have a car at the time. And my dad said something to me that he'd never said before. He said, I've always trusted you and I've never questioned your, I don't know if he said integrity, but maybe I've never questioned your integrity until now. He said, so, do what you want, but we don't agree with this. And I felt awful. And I told him, hey, I'm not going to go, sorry. Sorry, I was so demanding about it, et cetera. And then he left and came back and gave me the keys. And I went into I got into his truck, and it was the gas tank was full, and there was my favorite drink, which was Mountain Dew Code Red at the time, a bunch of Slim Jims and snacks that I liked. It was everything that I wanted. And, he said, have a good trip. And I trust you, go do whatever you think is best. And in that moment, I felt loved unconditionally. I just had this fight with my parents. And, love to me looks like a full tank of gas filled with your, favorite, road trip foods.
Yeah.
And I think that unconditional love feels like when you are in the wrong, which is how I felt. It doesn't matter what you think about any of that. I was doing something that I knew my parents would disagree with, and I was mad that they wouldn't let me do it. And so I felt like I was in the wrong. And I think unconditional love is you are in the wrong and the relationship is still whole. It is still intact. And I feel most loved when I am clearly in the wrong and I'm still loved for who I am, not what I've done or haven't done.
Yeah. Jeff, that's a beautiful example. You have sailed through the gauntlet. Thank you. Thanks for your time and thanks for sharing so much with us about what really is your field of expertise. We'll have, as I said before, links in the show notes to your website and your books. But yeah, I really appreciate your time today, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Steve.
For more resources, visit stevecusswords.com or missioalliance.org.